Clabberton. Welcome to Conversing. It's a gift today to have Dr. Shirley Mullen as our guest on Conversing. Shirley has been the president of Houghton College until recently and served in that role for 15 years. She retired in May of 21. She has spent altogether 4 decades in the work of faith-based liberal arts education. And she served as president at Houghton and also in various other roles, including classroom professor, chief academic officer, and residence life director. Her academic training is both with doctorates in history and in philosophy. She's a person of deep mindfulness and a readiness and a joy of spirit that says, I want to see, I want to know, I want to understand. And these are qualities that shine in this book that we're going to have an opportunity to discuss today, a recent book, newly released, called Claiming the Courageous Middle. Shirley, I'm just so delighted that you can join Conversing today. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to be here, Mark. I love talking about the book, and I've always enjoyed our conversations.
Well, you're a creative and deep thinker, and I love this book, and I'm eager for people to give it a close read and to benefit from your insights. The title itself is a title that it seems like the logical place to begin, because in a way, the nature of the book is captured in a certain way in the title itself, and it sort of lays open some of the main questions that I think any reader to this book is going to want to ask. So let's just begin right there. The title, again, is Claiming the Courageous Middle, Daring to Live and Work Together for a More Hopeful Future. Tell us about why the word middle is so important to you, what it means and what it doesn't mean in this case.
I'll begin, Mark, by saying I looked a long time for another word other than middle, because middle is such a potentially problematic term in our culture. It has all kinds of connotations of compromise, moral laziness, intellectual irresponsibility, sitting on the fence. It's definitely a word that has a bad reputation. So I would have been delighted to have found a better word, and really did think about that for a long time. But then as it turned out, it seemed like there wasn't a better word than middle that didn't have another set of problems, because some people had talked about third way, there were other phrases, but every other word also had problems. So that's why I decided to stay with middle. And then, first of all, the notion of a courageous middle was with me from the very beginning. The idea that the middle doesn't have to be a place of timidity, mushiness, compromise, vagueness, lukewarmness, to use that distinctively Christian notion. And actually, central to the argument of the book is that this very difficult place of the middle, this place of maybe not quite sitting, this place that is associated with passivity, can actually become a place of proactivity, agency, urgency, and activism. And that's why the idea of courageous, and then actually adding claiming to the title, because courageous added to middle means that it doesn't have to be a place of timidity. It can be a place of courage. Although I should add one more thing here, Mark. I want to be very clear that it also can be all of those horrible things. The middle can be a terrible place. But the point of the book is it doesn't have to be, it ought not to be. And that for a certain set of people in our society, the people that I'm trying to tap into in writing the book, they need to make a conscious decision to claim the courageous middle. So the notion of courageous middle is definitely not a default, position. It's something that has to be claimed. It's an act of intentionality. It's an act of commitment. And so that's really where I landed. And I feel good about where I landed, but believe me, it was a long time in coming because of all the problems with the notion of the middle. But again, I'll just close this by saying the very juxtaposition, though, of courageous and middle is what has created a lot of the stir when I would tell people I was writing about the courageous middle. And now that people have seen the title, their response is, oh, that sounds intriguing. So I feel good about where we landed.
Yes. No, I think it's a very provocative and helpful title. And I think your definition of it just then is really helpful. So Shirley, given what you've just said about the definition of an explanation of the title, perhaps the word that I want to push on a little bit more is seems like an innocuous word, but it's actually the word the. So is there something that is the courageous middle? Is there something that is the middle? And if so, what is it modifying and including or excluding?
Mark, that is a great question. And you're the first person who's asked me that, but that gives me a chance to respond to something that I think is actually quite important, which is that the middle is always relative to a context. So as you'll find out when you read the book, the notion of the middle is always relative to a particular moment in time. I would go even further and say that it's relevant to the particular situation that individuals are in. And so this is why when I talk about how do you become a person of the courageous middle, I start with the idea that individuals need to think about, where do you find yourself in situations where you have people on both the right and left of you who trust you more than they trust the people on the other side of you? And so when you find yourself in those situations, whether it's family or workplace or church, and when you understand something about each of those sides that maybe they don't understand about themselves, or when you feel like you are torn or feel like you don't quite fit in either of those places, then you are starting to feel the invitation or the call of the courageous middle. Because in those moments, you can either decide, okay, I'm just going to go silent, I'm going to just stay torn, or you can say, I am going to choose to be an interpreter, to be a bridge builder. I like the notion of bilingual. I use that a lot. The idea that you understand something about these two sides that they don't understand about each other. And you then, as that person in that middle, have the opportunity to convene a conversation, to spend some of your credibility and trust, because it will take that. Because both sides are going to say, what are you asking me to do? Don't you agree with me? Well, I see where you're coming from, but I'd like to invite you to a conversation where you will be honored, you will be have a chance to speak, but you will also have a chance to listen to other people who perhaps have chosen a different road. Another assumption of that courageous middle is that there are people on both sides who are good and thoughtful, who have things to say. And the job of the person in the middle is to convene conversations that don't minimize the convictions of either side, but invite people to hear something they have not previously understood. For example, how could someone who's a good person think that way? And so you become an activist agent in the middle, asking questions, convening, showing graciousness, being entirely unflappable in the middle, and making sure that everyone is respected. And then out of that, you seek to either come to a larger vision of the truth, something more complicated, or maybe if it's a problem you're working on, You imagine a solution that neither side would have seen by itself. But part of the assumption of the courageous middle is that there's a great deal of energy being wasted right now by people on both sides, actually, who are afraid of letting go of their current convictions for fear of ending up in some abyss of relativism or mushiness. And the agent in the courageous middle is bringing that together so that together something can be created that would not have been there before. And there are examples of that are talked about in the book. But anyway, I'm going to go back to your initial question. There is no the courageous middle in the abstract. It's always contextual. It's always relative to a particular situation. And I would say it's always relative even to the particular individual. So at one point in the book, I say that even though there is a company of the courageous middle, no one in that company of courageous middle looks exactly like anyone else. Because the very things that prepare us to be effective agents of the courageous middle will grow out of our individual stories, our backgrounds, our families, our church context, maybe our professions, maybe our cultural background. So there's no the courageous middle. There are many opportunities to be in the courageous middle contextually and in concrete circumstances.
I want to say for those who haven't read the book that one of the things that you do, Shirley, that's I think very helpful is that very frequently from early in the book, you start using the phrase middle space. And I think middle space is what you've just described. It's a middle space that exists, which is not aligned with one of the poles, but is holding a space in that is a space as opposed to a pinpoint, and therefore distinguishes it from the poles, but also gives space for more people inside that sphere, which is what you've just described beautifully. So let me ask this. When I think about the dilemma of our polarized era and the intensity of polarization that we're experiencing, and that there are two things that particularly come to my mind when I think about even the middle space. One is in a fight for justice, which both hardcore left, hardcore right are fighting for, they are not looking for some kind of middle, and I'll use here pejoratively, middling answer. So there's that. And then paired with that, as almost an intrinsic quality, seems to be fear. That fear is primarily what drives people to the most extreme version of this, because it's not just an issue, let's say, that they have great concern about, but they are extremely concerned. And among the reasons why they are extremely concerned is really because of fear itself. So what happens to justice in the courageous middle? And also what happens to fear?
Well, first of all, I really think what you've identified, Mark, is exactly right. Fear is so dominant in every space we're involved in. And that needs to be named, because there are some good things that make people afraid. They don't want to let go of their convictions. They don't want to let go of what seems right to them. And there is that fear that if they move toward the middle, that they're going to end up on the other side. So part of what goes with this current moment is that all or nothing thinking, that if I abandoned the pole, if I move from the pole, I'm going to end up on the other side. And so part of the assurance that's required of the successful or effective agent of middle space is to help people understand that you are not being asked to give up what you currently believe in coming to the middle, that you will have opportunity to express that, to hear from others who have not ended up there. So people need to be reassured that their dignity will be protected, that they will not be made to look foolish or stupid or something like that. So yes, the agent of the middle has to describe the middle in such a way that allows people to realize they are not going to have to lose something in coming to the middle. It may be risky, but the risk is the potential of gaining something. So let me come back to your question about justice. An agent of the middle cannot guarantee that justice will be created. What I think an agent of the middle can do, though, is create the conditions in which justice is more likely to emerge. So let me speak to that. I believe that so much of the challenge right now is that people on the right and left are talking past each other. So when there's a villainization of the other side, and you talk to the one side, well, what are you afraid of? Or what do you think those people are like? If you truly are bilingual and you understand both sides, you can actually see that that the caricature they built of the other side is actually part of what is inhibiting us from coming to a place where we can think more creatively about justice. So there are false beliefs often about what is driving the other side. So I think that part of this notion of the middle is to provide a guarantee, to the extent that you can speak about that, of dignity and safety. And I know that word safe has all kinds of complicated connotations right now, but a protection of dignity that allows you to listen. The other thing that I think is part of this middle work is justice is not just an abstract argument. And so I want to use your question about justice to get to something else. Part of what's standing in the way right now of most of the issues in our culture, whether it's how we think about abortion or how we think about immigration, is because what the polls do is accentuate argument. They accentuate the abstraction. They accentuate what are, in fact, the strong points of either side. That's what argument and debate does. It's designed to bring out those things. But it also brings them out in the abstract. See, when you're really talking about justice, it's not an abstract concept. It's always attached to real people. It's attached to real situations. It's not something that can be weaponized in a language of argument. And so when we're really talking about justice, if anything, the kind of polarization that we're involved in right now, whether it's, again, around immigration or whatever, is as long as we're polarized, we're staying with the strong points of each argument. We're not really looking for creative solutions to find out what is the other side? How can the other side help us with maybe the weaker points of our side? So if you can make sure that people feel that they will be heard, they will be treated with dignity, then you can come to the middle and really work with situations that preserve the strengths of both sides, but then allow for creative engagement around what we might call the weaker points, or the places that each side has not dared to think through for fear that they're compromising the strength of that side. So there's a lot there that I just said, but let me summarize, because you asked about justice. The most important thing I would want to stay with is that justice, as long as it's just an abstract argument and something you put on a poster and something you wield and weaponize, it's not actually going to create justice in the real communities of our society, because real justice requires that we see people, that we treat people as real human beings, and that we come to terms with concrete contextual circumstances. And see, that's what that work of the middle is all about, moving beyond abstraction to concrete particularity and seeing people, not just arguments.
So I love what you've said, Shirley, and both of us have had experience of leading institutions of higher education. Both of us, therefore, have had experiences of student demonstrations. So I want to move this quite specifically then into what is not meant to be an abstract conversation, but to really ground it. So we know today, as we are having this conversation, that there are student demonstrations regarding Gaza, Israel and Gaza, happening on many, many campuses. They're ferocious. They are determined. They are full of anguish, full of charges and anxiety around anti-Semitism on the one hand, and full of charges of anti-Palestinian mindfulness as well, and about abuses of power, which both sides are making of the other in different ways. So I'm not trying to put you in a position of second guessing any of the presidents of the institutions that are literally facing this. And neither you nor I are currently serving in such a senior administrative role at the moment. So as a consequence, I realize there's distance here, but I'm hoping that distance can be helpful. So if you were to try to apply claiming the courageous middle on a campus right now where there are demonstrations going on regarding Israel and Palestine, how would you want to orchestrate that in order to claim the courageous middle that you've been describing?
Well, Mark, you couldn't have picked a harder issue right now. I mean, because everything you mentioned, what we're seeing right now in the campuses has all the components of intense emotion, concern for justice. Well, first of all, and again, I want to say again what you just said. Neither you or I are presidents right now. Any individual president is going to know more about the particularities of their campus than either you or I know. But
yes,
I will say I will apply the same principles that I applied to situations on my own campus when there were two sides who were both angry, thought they were right, were holding out very high stakes principles. I did try to actually make sure that I was listening to both sides. I tried to walk into the actual physical space. I mean, you try to not be afraid. You don't hide out in your office. And again, I'm very conscious, even as I'm speaking, that some of this would also depend if you're in a situation that might be violent. I mean, you've got to make sure that you're not making things worse, but do everything you could to be present to both sides. So you're listening, do everything you can to make sure that you have heard as well as you can what both sides want to make sure they are making clear. And it might even be that you would not do it by yourself, that you would have some of the people listening to make sure you really have heard. Because I think part of what creates the intensity of these polarization is that fear that the other side is not going to understand the weight of what I'm saying. So it would be creating a very clear listening and checking and double checking for understanding. And again, it might involve creating a neutral space in a building and inviting representatives to come. I mean, you would have to think this through really clearly, but make sure that both sides are listened to and feel heard. And then you might try to come up, okay, what are the most important points that need to be protected and explored? And again, this has to be done expeditiously, quickly. I do think somewhere in there, though, there has to be also space created for understanding what the other side does not believe that this side understands. So once you heard from each side, you create space where there is an opportunity for listening. And again, even as I'm speaking, Mark, I'm realizing that this sounds Pollyanna, because even from a much less volatile situation that I was involved in, this requires vigilance, intense risk, but I believe it can be done. And I think it's better than anything that we have it's better than violence. Somewhere in there, after there has been the listening and then the exchange of listening, and again, I would move to a step, because part of what often accounts for the intensity of each side is that each side is very clear about the rightness of what they know, but then there are often lots of things that they actually don't understand, that are part of what the other side understands so clearly. And in some cases, this is about history. In some cases, it's about just even understanding how somebody who is morally sensitive and intelligent could think differently. So, I mean, some of this, once you've de-escalated the threat of violence, you really would have to create some sustained frameworks of protected ground, opportunity for listening. And again, depending on how much you're trying to solve, you would have to then give this some extended time. And part of the challenge is in these moments that call for courageous middle work, so much is done on social media, so much is created by rage that it's not fully informed. And again, I say this carefully because when justice is at stake, you feel like, well, I can't stop to listen. So there has to be our risk involved. And this is where I'm saying, I think those with visible authority have to be willing to step in the middle at some sort and say, look, it's so important to me. It's so important to us. It's so important, whether it's the university or whether it's the country, it's so important that we are going to take time to hear both sides. And anyway, I'm going to stop there, Mark, but it's something like that. But there's always risk involved. There's always presence involved. And there's always I would say, going overboard to make sure that each side feels heard before you're asking them to listen to the other side. Anyway, that's where I would start.
I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing. Well, I think that's a really great answer. I do think that one of the great challenges of that moment of leadership is managing one's own fearfulness. So it just comes down to, am I able to be and find, in the context of my own personhood, in the context of my own leadership, in the context of my own Christian faith, am I able to find a calming center that gives me freedom, not disengagement in the least, just freedom in the middle of the conflict, so that I can be there genuinely as a learner and, yes, also as a leader, but not only as a leader, but also a leader who learns, who listens, who tries to really genuinely hear and then respond without a kind of authoritarian reaction. That's especially hard, I think, when schools are facing contexts of violence, which I don't think either of our schools experienced, but which felt emotionally violating for many people, but they were not physically violent, and it didn't involve police or any other kind of form of external authority. But I'm just moved by the significance of this moment in our culture, and literally to be having this conversation while there's so much going on that is being vividly enacted. I mean, even if we didn't have these demonstrations, we could have easily pointed to various examples. But because right as we're having this conversation, all of this is happening, it just underscores, I think, the significance of what you're trying to call people to. And this language of claiming, I think, is really critical, rather than falling into it or resigning to the middle, to actually claim the middle for this courageous and creative effort of trying to bring voices from the poles and around the middle for its own sake to a conversation and an engagement that takes the reality of the real issues and suffering and pain that's often involved with the greatest of seriousnesses.
So, Mark, I don't want to leave this point yet because first of all, the test of this notion is kind of work in the real world. So I want to just stay with what you've raised here for a moment. So being in the courageous middle, whether it's a violent situation or whether it's a more moderate situation, and some of this would tap into some of the historic notions around pacifism and that kind of thing. But I'm not going down that road right now. I want to say, though, there will always be risk involved. And the relationship of power and risk is really interesting here. Because, see, the very thing that, again, going back to a college president's role or a seminary president's role, you have the authority to call certain things into being. But the very calling those things into being, whether it's in an effort to prevent violence, whatever it is, the very authority you're using to call this thing into being is also put at risk. And see, this is where, coming back to your point, if you are so afraid of your own position or your own reputation, again, I'm not saying that you're foolish about it, but you just have to know that there is a spending of credibility, there is a spending of authority to move into this direction. And so, again, you can't prevent that. I think that's part of the risk. I do think that if you do have a trusted body of people who can help you think ahead of how you minimize the loss of credibility, not for your own sake, but for your ability to keep working in the situation. Because if you're forced to resign immediately, that's actually not going to allow you to stay in that middle. So I'm not advocating a kind of trading in, but I'm acknowledging a tension there, that the very credibility that you have to put into play will be put at risk. And you want to be as wise as you can be about spending that so that you are able to continue working in that space. And this is where you have to build some degree of trust with whoever's on both sides. You have to make sure you're listening. And so, again, I just want to say you can't be concerned primarily for your own reputation. You can't be concerned primarily for your own position. You have to care about, hopefully, the very reason that you were entrusted with that authority in the first place. So these moments really do test the character at a very deep level of what has given people authority in the first place. And again, in the end, and I'll say this from a Christian standpoint, in the end, only God will know whether we have really spent our credibility in the best way possible. Now, in a more secular context, you could say, well, history will judge. But at the very least, a leader cannot do nothing. At least I would say they owe it to the stewardship of their calling to do everything in their ability, everything in their best creativity and imagination to spend that credibility wisely for the sake of moving the community beyond that polarization. Anyway, but I just wanted to say that the relationship of power and authority and suffering and loss of power, it's there. And you cannot guarantee that you will save your power once you enter into the courageous rhythm. You can't. That's the nature of it.
Right.
But well, you might, but you might inspire. See, this is the other thing. See, part of the risk involved is you can't always know the outcome. So, for example, let's say you decide to do something very courageous. You may lose your position, but it might inspire someone else to pick up the baton. So this is where my final point is. In the work of the courageous middle, you have to realize in the end, it's not about you. It's about something much larger. In the Christian world, we would say it's about the power of the Holy Spirit. It's about God's sovereignty. It's about making ourselves available for God's work in a bigger way than we can even imagine. So those are my additional thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's extremely helpful and very, very important. I've often said it's just always live theater. So life is live theater, and the things that you're raising are things that get worked out in the very moment. Now they can actually be prepared for.
Improvisation is a key notion in live theater.
It is, and it's key because that's how life comes at us, and there's no way of being able to predict various things that are going to happen. So part of the preparation and readiness, part of this sense of claiming, which I think is just such an important word, involves inhabiting the space in which this is that to be in the courageous middle is not a surrender, and it's not an abandonment of passion, and it's not an abandonment of rage even. It is a willingness to create a different kind of space that can hold all of that in its tensions rather than in its surrender or in its exacerbation, which the poles tend to be better at doing than the middle does, while not domesticating things. This is always one of my great concerns about the middle, is that it is not a call to domestication of feelings, emotion, history, tragedy, suffering, pain. Like all that has to be vividly present in order for this work of the courageous middle to be able to be appropriately held, so that you're not saying they're there to any side, right, as though somehow you're the judge of this. You're just trying to be a different kind of container for a different sort of engagement than simply the polarizations that have so often only exaggerated concerns and not really helped move forward.
Mark, I'm so grateful that you're making this point, because you're right. That's another problem with the notion of the middle, that it's somehow a place of calm and peace. But no, that's not true. It's a place where you must name things accurately. You actually look for a more complete understanding of naming things accurately, because see, part of the problem with the poles is the poles understand where they see injustice, where they see abuse of power or whatever, but it's in the messiness of that larger reality of the middle, that there's a more complete naming of the pain, the suffering, what needs redemption. And very honestly, Mark, while I believe that the notion of the courageous middle has broad applicability outside the Christian context, part of my passion in writing this is I believe really thoughtful Christian people are the best candidates to be in the courageous middle. Because see, we believe in resurrection. And see, I'm not saying that glibly, but I'm thinking of a quote that comes from actually Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who talks about, if we only could learn to live from resurrection every day, everything would be different. And I don't pretend to fully understand what that means, but at the very least, it has to mean something like what looks like the end from our rational perspective is not the end when God's power comes into the mix. And certainly Bonhoeffer's own life would illustrate that. I mean, I thought so many times about, Bonhoeffer could have ended his life as a theologian or ethicist at a German university, and nobody would have heard of him outside the academy. Instead, he is a quintessential inspirer for so many different models. And so that willingness to put our very best thinking and our very best imagination and moral commitment to name things accurately and to open up the possibility of something new coming in, it's bigger than any of us, and it's bigger even than we can fully calculate. So I just want to introduce, again, that notion of resurrection beyond what we can imagine, that naming things accurately, being willing to bring everyone to that messy middle. Lots of new things can happen. It's back to your point about live theater.
Right. And as someone else has said, in light of the resurrection, I think that that the worst thing is never the last thing.
Exactly.
And the resurrection puts that point in all caps. I do think, for the sake of those who haven't read this book, that one of the things about the argument that you're making that I think is so important is, first of all, that you're making it as a historian. So it's a statement about you and about the discipline that you have given your life to academically, which has given you, in a way, a vocation of trying to come to an ever more complete storytelling, right? That's one way of defining what history is about. And then linked with that, through your own understanding of the scriptures, that the understanding and assurance of the authority of the Bible is not a way of closing out the story, but actually letting the full texture of the Bible and the narrative that we find throughout the Bible and the narratives that we find throughout the Bible is allowed to have its full completeness, which often, again, our interpretations can often play to certain assumptions that we bring to the text rather than letting the text actually speak in its fullness. So one of the things I want to just commend again to the listeners is that in this book, Shirley demonstrates this both with historical examples, but also with some pretty wonderful exposition of various biblical narratives in which she's lifting up examples both in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament, of narratives that are actually very complicated, and in their complexity, not sidestepping the unfinished details that we would wish at times could have been tidied up so that we would have something more emphatic or utterly clear to say. Not that there aren't, as you point out, strong, clear arguments in the Bible, but it's also the case that there's a lot of texture and contextualization, which is part of the nature, not least of an incarnational God. So I just think that's a great strength of the book, Shirley.
Well, thank you, Mark. And given our time, I don't want to wander off in ways that you don't want to wander off. But this point you've named is so important. See, most people's understanding of the scriptures are really shaped by what comes down to a very rationalistic set of tests that was applied to the scripture in the end of the 19th century.
Yes.
And even our language around, what is true and the nature of truth has been so shaped by that reductionist notion of rationalistic framing of truth toward the end of the 19th century. And I just want to comment here that this is where I'm so thankful to have been an historian. When I was very young, I was very logical in my thinking. I thought argument was everything. But see, there's so much about the reality of the world that cannot be contained in a syllogism. And right. See, history opens up the possibility of a much larger category for truth. It's not like, oh, it's false. No, it's an enlarged sense of the truth. And I mean, this is where my love for history and philosophy is so intertwined, because a lot of people think of history as it's just a dull, boring facts. No, but it's that nature of historical truth that really captivated me early on and continues to captivate me, because if you understand that, you then have a much greater ability to understand the richness of both the Old and New Testament, which were written not in the categories of the Enlightenment. I mean, so again, I just want to commend the discipline of history, the richness of narrative truth. And again, I'll end where you started. Yes, it's all about getting your story big enough. And see, if you want to use that language to go back to the poles, what both poles do is they cast the other side as the villains in their own story.
Yes,
rather than really going or having the courage to go for a richer, fuller understanding. Because it does take a lot of imagination to think that somebody who hasn't reached your own conclusion about something could be both potentially a good and thoughtful person. It's so much easier just to have large villains and large heroes. And this is also where, again, a Christian theology is so helpful, because Christian theology makes place for all of our finitude. We can have a partial seeing of the truth, but room to grow. Christian theology makes room for our finitude, but also our fallenness. And this is, again, why it's so important to have that more complete story. So again, I love that notion, and I may draw on it again. It's coming to a bigger story.
Shirley, that's the perfect way to end our conversation. So much more to be said and discussed about this book. And thank you again for all you've given to the writing of it, but also to this conversation today. It's really been a gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for the privilege of sharing. I do hope that lots of people will be drawn to imagine the roles that they can play in a bigger story.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they are released. And please leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.